Most people who grew up too fast don't have a dramatic story to tell about it. There was no single moment, no clear before and after, just a gradual accumulation of things that fell to them, responsibilities that were too large for their age, emotional weight that should have been carried by someone older, a version of daily life that required them to be, in ways nobody said out loud, more adult than they were. They managed the house. Or they managed a parent's mood. Or they became the one everyone leaned on, the one who kept the peace, the one who could be trusted to handle it, whatever it happened to be that day. And the adults in their lives, when they noticed it all, said things like, "You're so mature for your age." And the child received that as a compliment. And something in them quietly agreed to keep going. Here's what's curious about that. Mature for your age is one of the most common things said to children who are carrying weight that isn't theirs to carry. And it's said with genuine admiration. But what it's actually describing, what's happening underneath the capability, is a child who learned that their needs were secondary to a situation, who adapted to that reality, who found a way to function inside it so effectively that the functioning became their identity. And the identity followed them out. Psychologist Gregory Jerkovic, whose research on what he called parentification is among the most cited in developmental psychology, documented this pattern carefully. He identified two distinct forms. Instrumental parentification, the child who takes on the practical tasks of running a household, caring for younger siblings, managing logistics that belong to adults. And emotional parentification, arguably the more invisible and the more lasting, where the child becomes the emotional anchor of the family. The one who reads the room, who manages the parents' anxiety, absorbs their stress, regulates their moods, who learns without being taught that their job is to make sure the adults around them are okay. Both leave marks. But the emotional form leaves marks that take decades to find. There was a version of you, much younger, who learned something important about survival. That being needed was safer than being vulnerable. That being capable kept the peace. That asking for things made the room uncomfortable. You didn't learn that in a classroom. You learned it by watching, by feeling, by adapting. I've written about where this starts and how it follows us. Link in the description. And in the first pinned comment. John Bowlby's work on attachment describes something he called role reversal, a pattern that emerges when the relationship between parent and child becomes inverted. When the child is called upon, consistently, to provide the attunement and emotional regulation that the parent cannot provide for themselves, the child's own developmental needs get quietly set aside. Not rejected, not punished, simply deprioritized by a situation that didn't leave room for them. And the child adapts. Because children always adapt. That's what makes them so resilient, and so quietly vulnerable to exactly this. What gets lost in that adaptation is specific. And it doesn't disappear. It simply goes unmet year after year, until the child is an adult who can no longer easily identify what was missing. Here's what developmental psychology has documented consistently. Childhood has tasks, not chores, developmental tasks. Learning to play without purpose. Learning to need things without consequence. Learning to be small in the presence of someone larger and to have that feel safe rather than dangerous. Learning that you can fall apart and someone will help you put yourself back together. These aren't luxuries. They're the raw material of how a person learns to relate to themselves and to others. And the child who grew up too fast often misses them. Not dramatically, but in ways that show up years later, as things they can't quite explain. The adult who doesn't know how to rest without guilt. Who can relax only after everything is handled, and there is always something still to handle. Who, when someone treats them gently and without condition, feels vaguely uncomfortable, like they haven't done enough to deserve it yet. The adult who, given an afternoon with no responsibilities, doesn't know what they enjoy. Not because they're boring, because for most of their life, enjoyment was never the point. And there's something else that almost nobody talks about with this pattern. The competence is real. The capability is real. The person who grew up managing things that children shouldn't have to manage becomes, in many cases, genuinely capable in ways that other people admire and depend on. That part isn't a lie. But underneath it, quieter, less visible, harder to reach. There is a child who was never given permission to be small, who was never allowed to not know the answer, who was never allowed to need without immediately finding a way to make that need manageable for everyone else, who learned that being a child, really being one, fully without function, was something they simply didn't get to do. And that child didn't disappear when the adult showed up. They're still there, still waiting, in the quiet moments between responsibilities, to find out what it would have felt like to be held instead of held responsible. That's what growing up too fast actually costs. Not the practical skills, not the capability. Those stayed. What it costs is the felt sense, the one that lives in the body, not the mind, that it's safe to be small, that you're allowed to not have it together, that someone somewhere will handle it if you don't. And that felt sense doesn't restore itself automatically once the conditions change. This is one of the things that makes growing up too fast such a long-lived pattern. Not the skills it produced, not even the habits, but the gap in felt experience. The adult can know intellectually that they are safe, that no one is relying on them right now in the way the child was relied on, that the room isn't going to shift if they put something down. They can know all of this and still not feel it. Because felt safety, the kind that lives in the body's baseline, in the nervous system's resting state, isn't produced by knowing. It's produced by having experienced it enough times, over enough of the developmental window, to become the default. And for the person who grew up too fast, the developmental window was occupied with something else. The experience of being held without being needed, of being small in the presence of someone who was large, of falling apart and being helped back together, rather than being the one who held the family together. Those experiences, ordinary for a child with a certain kind of childhood, simply didn't accumulate. Which means the adult isn't lacking knowledge. They're lacking data. The data that comes only from having been, at a formative level, genuinely taken care of. You can learn a great deal from a book. That particular thing can only be learned from being held. Most people who grew up too fast have never fully believed that. And so they keep handling it. Everything. Always. Because the alternative, the possibility of putting something down and trusting it will be caught, was never something they got enough practice with to believe in. If this video felt less like content, and more like a conversation, that's because it was meant for someone exactly like you. Everything I know about this pattern, where it comes from, what it costs, and what changes when you finally understand it, is linked in the description, and in the first pinned comment. Now I want to speak to you directly. Ask yourself, do you know how to rest? Not sleep rest. The kind that doesn't require you to have earned it first. The kind where you're not catching up on something or preparing for something else. A stillness. Without the low hum of things undone. And when someone takes care of you, not because you did something that warranted it, but simply because they wanted to, does that feel natural? Or does it feel like something is slightly off? Like you're waiting for the condition to appear, the thing they'll eventually need in return. And this one, which may be the most important. When you imagine a version of yourself that didn't have to hold everything together, who needed more, asked more, was smaller and less capable and less indispensable, what do you feel toward that version? If the answer is something close to contempt, or impatience, or sadness, that's worth sitting with. Because that version wasn't weak. That version was a child who deserved to be one. You cannot go back and receive what you should have received. That's one of the genuinely painful things about growing up too fast. There's no undoing it. Time is gone. But you are not required to keep living as though you're still in the house where the function came first. You are not required to keep earning rest, or gentleness, or the simple experience of being taken care of. Those things are allowed now. Even if they don't feel like it yet. And maybe that's what slowly changes first. Not the capability which you've earned and which is real, but the permission. The quiet, internal permission to let something be someone else's job. To not know. Task. To be, every once in a while, the one who needs something. Not instead of who you've become. In addition to them. If something in this video found you today, leave a comment. Tell me one thing you never got to be as a child that you're still figuring out how to be now. I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, this channel is for exactly this kind of conversation. Subscribe because the next video goes into something that lives right next to this one. The pattern that forms when a child learns, early, that they are not allowed to be weak. It goes somewhere most people haven't looked.